Hello, and not welcome to Not Read, Not Read. Today we are not talking about This Is Not a Novel, which may or may not be a novel by David Markson. So I've talked about David Markson before, twice on this channel. Every book of his that I have read has always been a kind of stunning experience. The first one I read was Reader's Block, and then I read Wittgenstein's Mistress, and I've made videos for both of these. For this video, so I'm only going to be talking about This Is Not a Novel. This collection is This Is Not a Novel and other novels, and I have read all of them, but just for the sake of keeping the video concise, I'm going to talk just about the first one. So just some context for it. Near the end of his life, David Markson worked on a tetralogy of works, which included Reader's Block and these three novels, and they were called the kind of note card tetralogy because these books all have the same format or the same storytelling device, which is that it is a string of trivia, literary anecdotes, and then just kind of facts from history. But what happens is that Markson sort of uses the list to reveal something that is greater than the list. And again, I'm not going to talk too long about it because I made a whole video gushing about Reader's Block, but in Reader's Block it seemed like Markson was able to create this really glorious Lovecraftian experience of making me fear knowledge with every single upcoming sort of anecdote that hooked me and had me just absolutely addicted to reading it. And then I realized that it's just going to put me in the same position as author, or reader rather. Author shows up in these novels, or like writer and novelist, and even though it uses the same thing, what I loved, like I said, is that it created a completely different experience where going through This Is Not a Novel, and there's an introduction by Anne Beattie which I'll probably jump back to and refer to every now and then, but we start off with an epigram by an epigraph by Swift, which is, "I am now trying an experiment very frequent among modern writers, which is to write upon nothing." So we're also getting a kind of Samuel Beckett trilogy vibe from it, but we start with, and the first couple of entries is this: "Writer is pretty much tempted to quit writing. Writer is wary under death of making up stories. Lord Byron died of either rheumatic fever or typhus or uremia or malaria, or was inadvertently murdered by his doctors who had bled him incessantly." And then we go on and we start to just get a real string of all of these trivia facts, and occasionally interspersed with just like notes or comments from the character, which is writer, and it's just kind of creating this image of the writer sitting alone in his apartment, and again just letting all of these bits of trivia kind of flood into his head. What I really liked is that whereas Reader's Block almost seemed to come across like a horror novel, one thing that I like is throughout the novel, throughout This Is Not a Novel, Markson is talking about how, he knows that he's getting to the end of his writing. He knows that he's going to start writing novels that are just going to be the format that he likes. And he talks throughout, he refers to This Is Not a Novel as being a number of different things. And one thing that I felt pretty happy that I kind of clued in on, and I haven't seen it show up in the Wikipedias, but surely somebody's written a scholarly article about it, is that it almost seems like in This Is Not a Novel, because of how often the Iliad gets referred to, it seemed like Markson set out to write the Iliad, but for authors instead of soldiers. It's because he talks about how in the Iliad, it's just got these long descriptions of hundreds of characters, and also explicitly describes the deaths of hundreds of characters, which of course we get, just on the first page, we get the death of Lord Byron, Stephen Crane, Bertolt Brecht, and then and also Mr. Coleridge. And so that's just the first page of what proceeds to be a 150-page novel. So yeah, that was a kind of cool. It's again, I just really want to stress how awesome it is that Markson is able to use this exact same format style, but create really 4 unique experiences with This Is Not a Novel, The Vanishing Point, which is the second novel, and then the last novel, which is of course the final novel. And so there are little things that kind of like hooked into it, or little themes that showed up. Again, I'm not going to talk about the later 2 books, but it seems like, as a really vague, general, just like impression, it seems like the first book is Riders Against the World, or like the Riders' Iliad. The second book is Riders Against Critics, and writers and authors or artists against criticism. And then the final book is Artists Against Themselves, and we get a lot more of the kind of gritty, less, less picturesque idea of interactions, just flicking into the last novel. The first entry that I saw is, "You have but 2 topics, yourself and me, and I'm sick of both," Johnson once said to Boswell. But anyway, let's jump in, and I'm just going to, again, probably not going to be too long of a video, but I'm just going to jump into random extracts, and some of them are just going to be, again, because I can't help myself, because I am utterly addicted to it, some of them are just going to be fun extracts that I will read, and then some of them are going to be extracts that deliberately paint the experience of what Markson is trying to do. He points out that the Globe Theatre burnt to the ground on June the 29th, 1613, and asks if any new Shakespeare plays that were not yet in the quarto publication burnt with it. And another thing that I liked is on the next page, he talks about how he wants to write that has no sequence of events, no passage of time, but then again, getting somewhere in spite of this, and even with a note of sadness at the end. And maybe it's important to just talk about it now, just so that it frames the rest of everything. Again, just in pure, beautiful coincidence, the book I read directly before this was Robert Burton's The Anatomy of Melancholy, and The Anatomy of Melancholy plays an important part in this book as well, so much so that the final line is the final line from The Anatomy of Melancholy, or one of the early publications of The Anatomy of Melancholy. And so something I only noticed right now, which is directly after he says, even with a note of sadness at the end, the next entry is just, "What porridge had John Keats?" ? Asked Browning. And John Keats talked about having read and having enjoyed The Anatomy of Melancholy. So he talks in Wittgenstein's Mistress about how reading the Iliad, it seemed like Homer was inspired by Shakespeare, but the reason is that the modern translators who have read Shakespeare and are translating the Iliad are working their knowledge into the translation of the Iliad, and that's a kind of really interesting way of how our kind of modern information paints the way that we translate ancient texts. But then Markson does the reverse thing, where he talks about people in Greek translating Shakespeare with influences of Homer, and it's one of those funny things where it's almost like the opposite or the reverse is obvious, and it shouldn't be as much of an emotional experience or an intellectual stimulation as it seems, but just pointing out the reverse, which seems almost like counter or anti-profound, but it becomes profound. He writes again, and we're only sort of 20 pages in and we're already getting references to the Iliad. "There is no mention of writing in the Iliad. Any and all messages are passed along verbally, indicating incidentally that not one of the Greek warriors during 10 years at Troy has ever sent a letter home." And again, a fun little bit of being self-referential through an anecdote or a trivia. "If you find this work difficult and wearisome to follow, take pity on me, for I have repeated these calculations 70 times, wrote Johannes Kepler. And that's another device that Markson will use, where he will sometimes introduce a quote by saying blah 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 said, and then the quote, but then sometimes he will just do the quote in isolation, and then in sort of and then he'll say who it was, and then sometimes he will say the quote so out of context that you won't know if it's him who said it. It'll probably seem like something that an author has said, but he hasn't indicated it, so you're not entirely sure. And then later down the page, he says blah blah blah. So he has this great blurring, or this blending of, when really is it writer talking? When is it, a figure from history? Is he allowing himself to blend in and become one of those figures? Does he want to, because he wants to secure his fame as a writer? And again, another subtle self-referential. The anecdote before is, my cook knows more about counterpoint, said Handel the first time he heard Gluck or Gluck. And then the next sentence, just completely out of context, is, let us go closer to the fire and see what we are saying. This is another cool one. Again, any time that I'm focusing or we have a reference to the Iliad, I'm going to focus a little bit more carefully because of how much I really believe that Markson is setting out to write the Iliad for authors. The death of Patroclus in Iliad 16. Even as he spoke, the shadow of death came over him. His soul fled from his limbs and went down to the house of Hades, bemoaning its fate, leaving manhood and youth. And then the next entry, the death of Hector in Iliad 22. Even as he spoke, the shadow of death came over him. His soul fled from his limbs and went down to the house of Hades, bemoaning its fate, leaving manhood and youth. So the common theme, and something that showed up in Markson's own life, is that he was very, so he apparently did not read a lot of contemporary literature, which of course shows, because you're reading all of these anecdotes about the latest author I think that he talks about is got to be the kind of Calvino, Umberto Eco, really nobody from, Markson died in, I think, 2007 or 2008, and, or maybe even a bit later. I'll do a little anecdote, a little pop-up to fact check that. But another trend that I noticed, and maybe it could have just been me missing certain key references, but the fact that they were so spare that I missed them means that they were spare. There's almost no references to movies either in This Is Not a Novel. We start to talk a little bit more about film and directors and actors and actresses in the later novels, but yeah, I thought it was even interesting that he's just still so focused on books, but then also he brings in an emphasis in this book that doesn't show up as much in others, where he talks a lot about musicians, and yes, he also talks about painters, but I feel like that was still a pretty important part in Reader's Block, and also especially in Wittgenstein's Mistress, because Kate, the main character, is a painter. I don't know if I'm reading either too much into this or too little into this, but there's an entry where Markson talks about a character, Palaemenes, who is fatally speared at the collarbone by Menelaus in Iliad 5 and is inadvertently shown alive again in Iliad 13. And I don't know if he's just kind of making the fun fact of talking about how an author died and then later on talking about a story of their life in this same book, or if there's more going on, or if there's not even that going on. And again, in a sort of poetic way, or just a nice kind of touching analysis of a historical event that we don't always consider. Leonidas and the 300 who would perish at Thermopylae, only men who had already fathered sons to leave behind had been permitted to join the command. This is one where I don't know if I'm missing a historical reference, or if there's a literal thing that's going on, or if this is specifically a side reference to Kate in Wittgenstein's Mistress. No matter how frequently, always given pause at remembering there is no colour whatsoever in the canvas. Markson has this running gag of talking about burning certain painters' works, and it comes up one time in every novel, where he says, if on a winter's night with no other source of warmth, writer were to burn a Roy Lichtenstein, qualms? Qualmless. And again, in the context of having read The Anatomy of Melancholy by Robert Burton and thinking about melancholy as this black bile, it being the root of the word, Markson makes a kind of reference where he says, quick spoilers for Madame Bovary, but he says, "Why hasn't Ryder ever known? What is the black liquid that spills out of dead Emma Bovary's mouth?" Oh yeah, so this one, I think this is the first time, page 90, where I got a reference to a film, which again is a film that is an adaptation of a novel, but he just, out of context, says, "I love the smell of napalm in the morning." And again, just kind of poking us to get us to look at the Iliad again, he writes, "Why does Ryder sometimes seem to admire the Iliad even more when he is thinking about it than when he is actually reading it?" He has this... So he devotes like 4 entries to talking shit about Harold Bloom claiming that he could read 500 pages an hour, and I'm just going to read all of them. Harold Bloom's claim to the New York Times that he could read at a rate of 500 pages an hour. Ryder's ass. Spectacular exhibition. Right this way, ladies and gentlemen. See Professor Bloom read the 1961 corrected and reset Random House edition of James Joyce's Ulysses in 1 hour and 33 minutes. Not one page stinted. Unforgettable. And then the next page. What's this? Can't spare an hour and a half? Wait, our matinee special, today only. Watch Professor Bloom eviscerate the Piers McGuinness translation of Wittgenstein's Tractatus. 8 minutes and 29 seconds flat. Guaranteed. Glad that he said this, because I still occasionally get comments about my faux pas in this regard. Will scholars of relatively recent English literature have any idea 3 or 4 centuries from now how differently the name Yeats and Keats were pronounced? Not even I know. And then following on that Iliad joke, he writes, "Why does Ryder sometimes seem to admire Ulysses even more when he is thinking about it than when he is actually reading it?" And again, I think that you can feel that about Ulysses as being a modern spin on the Odyssey, but then he's also just saying, let's remind you of the fact that modern interpretations exist of these classic tales. Markson, just with great dark humour, Montaigne could not swim. Unfortunately, neither could Shelley. And one more dig pages later. Did Professor Bloom take any books with him, do you know? Someone said he had a 26-volume complete Joseph Conrad. It's only a weekend cruise. And again, Markson kind of affirming, this is the line where he says, "Nonetheless, this is also in many ways even a classic tragedy, if Ryder says so." So I was just editing the video and I realized there's such an important point that I left out that I really needed to just do a quick janky phone recording. But one of the really, again, just touch of tragedy, beautiful things that Markson does in the end with sort of almost addressing the question of why does he have the right almost to write the Iliad for all of these creators, and why does he sort of, what connection does he have to them? And so often, we're getting all of these points of how a character died or how, a certain tragedy that happened to a character, but in this just like really delicately subtle, beautiful way, he talks about his own physical ailments and also his own sort of mental state, where he'll just occasionally work in words for despair. And in the last couple of pages, he just writes, out of nowhere, he just says, "Writer's silent heart attack." And then jumping a little bit later, the next page, he says, "Writer's right lung lobectomy and resected ribs." And then one of the, the fourth last entry, he just simply writes, "Writer's cancer." And so the way of sort of, yes, where like he's joined and connected to all of these creators because he's also a creator, but then of course he's also experienced, such pain and such tragedy that of course he has the right to talk about it for himself and for all of these other creators. And yeah, that's, I think, all I have really to say about This Is Not a Novel. Like I said, we end on a really kind of touching, beautiful note. I don't know how Markson has this insane way of just like 5 novels, 5 brilliant final tear-jerking endings. It's crazy. But anyway, This Is Not a Novel by David Markson and Other Novels. One more close-up of it to try and... with an introduction by Anne Beattie, and I really enjoyed it. As always, I enjoy seemingly everything by David Markson. Now that I've read Wittgenstein's Mistress and the Tetralogy, if you've read anything else by Markson, please let me know, because I would definitely love to read more by him. And yeah, thank you again for watching. I hope you enjoyed, and I'll see you in the next video.